You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. I want to thank you for joining me again. And this week we are going to be reading the Haftarah of Parashat Shmini. And Shmini is we can call a bittersweet type of reading. Because on the one hand, we read about the presence of God, and God coming down to the tabernacle and proving his presence there. But then we also read about the sadness of the loss of the two sons of Aharon, Nadav and Avihu. And I remember years ago when I was reading this as a kid, I think Leviticus, Vaikra, was studying this, I think to this very day, is still studying the 5th grade. And I remember reading this, and it was very, very sad. But then it made me wonder about our access to God. One of the most difficult features of being a servant of God is the fact that to really be a servant of God, you have to be obedient to every aspect of being a servant of God. And I think that the question of what exactly is a servant of God has been something that's been bothering people for many, many centuries. How do you know who's a true servant of God, and how do you know who isn't? And even those who really are can still make mistakes. And I think that's a very, very important thing to always remember. As Kohelet says, there is no righteous person on the land, on earth, that doesn't sin. Mistakes are made. But when you reach a level where you are a servant of God, where there is a burden of responsibility on your shoulders, one of the most important things to do is to always keep yourself in check. So last week, we read about keeping in check, making sure we don't reach erosion. This week, we're reading about not overextending our right and ability in doing things, which means there has to be a balance. Now, we're not talking about being on a middle path all the time. We're talking about keeping inside the boundaries of Torah and not allowing ourselves to overreach and not allowing ourselves to underreach. And the boundaries of Torah, even though sometimes we're not 100% sure exactly what things might mean, we do have the responsibility to try to the best of our ability to understand. But when something is explicit, the order is explicit, then even an authority like a Kohen cannot make a decision on their own opinion. They still have to work based on the balance which is given through Torah. In Parashat Shmini, we actually read about an overreach. The sons of Aharon take an esh zara, a foreign fire, which Asher lo tziva Adonai, which the Lord did not command, and they try to offer incense. And we learn from this, or we can accidentally learn from this, that coming or drawing near to God can only bring death and destruction. But then we have to also remember that the incense is something that was used daily in the temple. And incense was actually also used to save the people during plagues, which means that the path of Torah, if it is used correctly, is a path that gives life. But when it is abused or incorrectly used, it brings up God's wrath, it brings up God's anger. But this is something which is mostly in the hands of those who have authority, of those who have responsibility. And for a regular person, if they make a mistake, what they do, in an ideal manner, they go to a prophet or they go to the Kohen and they ask, is this right? Is this wrong? If the local teacher doesn't know, the Torah says you go up to the place your Lord your God will choose and you ask there. And they have to contemplate, to make decisions and make a decision to see who, what, where, and how. And based on that power of decision, a decision is made. However, if evidently suddenly more information is discovered and there was a mistake, there's still a way to fix it. However, in the service of the temple, everything is very, very, very detailed. And because everything is very detailed, the margin of error is reduced. So say, for example, it says in the Torah, you have to make tzitzit, or you have to dwell in a sukkah, or you have to write upon the doorposts of your home. And I'm deliberately choosing these cases. If one person understands this as being a literal way of doing things, while another person understands more as a metaphor, then there's still a margin somewhere of error. Meaning that, for example, if you think that writing upon your doorpost is more of a metaphor, while another person believes that it actually means that, or understands it actually means that you have to literally write or put something on your doorpost, that's still a margin of error. It's still okay. But then when, for example, you say you have to make tzitzit, and then a person says, I don't have to wear tzitzit because whatever, you find a reason. I don't have a four-cornered garment. Then that person has the responsibility to go get a four-cornered garment. If another person says it has nothing to do with a four-cornered garment, it has to do with wearing tzitzit on your clothing, and there's no four corners, that person has their understanding of what it is, but they're striving to wear tzitzit. So these two people are not necessarily saying something wrong. It's just one of them is trying to find a way of avoiding wearing tzitzit. But then you come to the sukkah, and there's the debate. Is a sukkah something you have to really sit in all the time? Or is it something that you have to build and be in it at least some of the time? How do you exactly build it? Do you use the four plants mentioned, the glorious fruit, the palm leaves, and so on? Or do you use something else and you use those four things for celebrating before God? And again, this is an issue of understanding exactly what the text is saying. It's an issue of interpretation. Your intention is still there. Your margin of argument is still there. But then when it comes to the temple, it becomes much more specific. And we have an entire book, not an entire book, but a large section of a book. Sorry, I have to correct myself. A large section of a book that goes into detail. What do you do with this? And when do you do this? And when do you do that? And how you do it, and so on. And what's very interesting about the temple service is that it's actually very simple and very repetitive, but yet mistakes are still made. And the way things got interpreted sometimes was obscured. It was not what the text actually meant. But it was on the responsibility of the priests to remember the lines, the borders inside that temple, which meant that their temple, the temple they served in, which was the tabernacle and the temple of Solomon, the margin of error was much smaller because there was a very, very precise way of doing things. And it was in the hands of a very, very small number of people. And they're the ones who had to make these decisions. Which means that when it comes to the margin of error in the temple, it shrinks dramatically. And it's under the authority of the priests to make the decisions how the temple is supposed to function. And the moment a priest, a Kohen, steps out of the margins of what the law allows him to do, he puts himself in risk, or at risk. And this is the case of responsibility. I'm not a Kohen. I am a Levite, but I'm not a Kohen. And there are things that I would turn to a Kohen to ask him, how is it done in these circles? How it's supposed to be done in the world of the Kohanim? I don't have a right to step into that world and make decisions for them. I can only advise, I can express an opinion, but a Kohen can say to me, listen, with all due respect to you, this is how it's done. We're in charge of this temple. So, what we learn from this is that the higher you go in the ranks, the margin shrinks, and you have more and more and more responsibility on your shoulders. And I've been contemplating the subject of responsibility for many, many years, because there are sometimes decisions that I have to make which are not easy. When you have a questionable situation, something that's not 100% clear, and you have to based on what you know, make a decision. That's always very, very difficult. And there have been years, for example, when we had to go out and say, for example, do the Aviv search. And by the way, I have to point out, I pre-record these, so I pre-record these sometimes several weeks in advance. And so right now, I don't know what the results of the Aviv search were. And my hope is that, noise from the past, hopefully, will all come to the same conclusion. Because there are two separate searches this year. Although, by the point you listen to this, there were two separate searches by the original team. We split up because of administrative issues that came up. But the issue is that I still have to go out and look at what I see and make a decision. This decision affects many, many, many people. But at the end of the day, a decision has to be made. We had previous years where, for example, at the search of 2018, last year, it was a very, very iffy situation. Same thing in 2016. In 2016, we had to make a decision that was so difficult that it ended up causing the number one person in the Aviv search to decide to quit everything because there was so much argument around it. And it broke my heart that he did this. But I understood him because it's a lot to take on your shoulders. And it gets very tiring when someone steps into something that you've worked on for so many years, you are the authority, and starts attacking. But it doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes. What it means is you have to be cautious. Now, I don't think there was a mistake made back in 2016. I think that the decision was actually accurate. And there are many details that I've been exposed to the last couple of years that actually demonstrate that our understanding of some of the issues regarding the Aviv have been misinterpreted and sometimes misunderstood by almost everyone. And the decision was actually very accurate because at the end of the day, this concept of Aviv is much broader than what most of us understand. And I'm currently studying this material under a very, very big, well-renowned expert on the subject. And I've actually presented some questions in regards to how to understand the calendar. And by the time this recording will come out, I already had the discussion with him. But you have to make decisions, and sometimes the decisions lay very heavy on your shoulders, and it's very difficult to make the decision. But sometimes a sporadic outburst of decision-making based on an emotional response or out of some kind of ideology as if you're better than someone can actually endanger everyone else and cause death. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm only using this as an example. Because the calendar, for example, has always been a massive argument. And there were people who left the Temple of Jerusalem because they made a decision that the calendar is not right, that the way the service is done is not right. And they get up and they leave. And there were arguments, and there were wars, and there was persecution. And it mostly stems from people being petty, and people being small, and wanting to be the authority. But the authority can sometimes make mistakes. But it doesn't mean that they're no longer walking with God. And it doesn't mean that they're no longer representing God's will. They made a mistake. There's a way to correct it. Unfortunately, sometimes the correction is disastrous. Sometimes the correction can be done through a sacrifice. But yet, the opening of the correction still exists. And the people surrounding have to stop, look, think for a second, and say, okay, let's try to understand this correctly. And see where the mistake lies. And then correct it. In the big joy of God accepting the temple, disaster strikes because someone wasn't obeying the rules. Someone was trying to make up their own Torah. And God said, no, especially not you. Our reading for this week is, for Parashat Shmini, is taken mostly from 2 Samuel 6. There are multiple traditions. I prefer to read the Sephardic tradition because it really deals with one unit. If you go with the Ashkenazi tradition, it jumps ahead into another subject which is actually kind of counterproductive to the discussion of the temple, because it's actually where God says to David, I'm not interested in the temple from you, which is a little counterproductive to the description of the idea of a tabernacle which does get built. But it is a tendency of the Ashkenazi practice to extend and do as much reading as possible. The Yemenites tend to add the beginning of chapter 7, which again becomes irrelevant to the reading. So to keep with the idea of Parashat Shmini, I actually prefer to go with the Sephardic reading here this time, because it really does keep into one unit that maintains a similar message to what we read in the parasha. Now, Shmini also deals with clean and unclean animals and many, many other subjects, where basically, after a mistake is made, God says, okay, let me produce this barrier here. You have to understand, you have the responsibility of maintaining the difference of structure of the camp between what is mundane and what is holy. So it's also a backdrop to a description of many, many commandments that have to do with being holy and clean, and what's unclean, especially when it comes to food and so on. And it's a way of telling Aharon, look, you're still perfectly fine. I still accept you. You're still going to be the Kohen. Your family are still going to be my servants. But I think there's a necessity here to remind you of your position, to remind you of your responsibility. And we have the exact same message in this reading, and this is why I would prefer to read the Sephardic reading, which is from 2 Samuel chapter 6, from verse 1 to verse 19, because it is a very closed and tight unit that strongly resembles the ideas that we read in the parasha. And the story is about the ark. The ark is very, very central in the book of Samuel. It's very interesting. We don't hear about the ark so much in Joshua. We only hear it when they cross the river. We never hear of the ark in Judges. Suddenly in the book of Samuel, the ark reappears. And the ark is central in the presence of God, but also as a judgment tool for anyone that comes in contact with it. So the beginning of the book of Samuel talks about the ark, and the middle of the book talks about the ark as well. And in both situations, we talk about the ark showing up and everyone rejoicing that God's presence is in the camp, but then disaster strikes twice. Everyone becomes very, very fearful of the ark. And then we don't hear about the ark for a very, very long time. And suddenly the ark reemerges. But again, we have the same problem, forgetting how to properly conduct oneself next to the ark. And what's the warning here? The warning here is if you want God's presence with you, you have to make sure that you do things correctly. Don't try to introduce into the Torah, don't try to introduce into the law things which are not of the intention of the law. Even though you think this brings glory, this brings honor, whatever you think, when it comes to items of the temple, there's a line. You have to do it this way, not that way. You can't make decisions based on whatever you feel is accurate. It's not about feeling, it's about knowing, it's about knowledge, it's about a proper understanding and proper conduct of the law to make sure that you respect God in the way that He ascribed that it's supposed to be done. So there are some practices today that I hear of. There was one practice that made everyone roll their eyes. And I get asked about this every once in a while. So first of all, there was a story that people base themselves based on what we read here, that there was some community, not sure where, but there was some community that made a model of the ark, and they would have wild dancing in front of this model. And I've seen videos of this, and everyone rolled their eyes because they say, oh, we're trying to be like David. When you're David, and you're on the spiritual and loyalty level of David, we can start talking. But you're not. There's a certain shameful behavior there. And there was another story that came up, I think this was in Colombia, where there's a community there that back in the 60s, I think 60s or 70s, a man established a community where they believe that all the men there are somehow priests. And today there are videos, I've seen videos where they build altars made out of stone and they do sacrifices. Now, first of all, we have to say, look, someone's doing sacrifices and so on. There were two separate responses. Some people were appalled. How dare you? This is not in the temple and so on. Some people said, look, they're doing sacrifices. This is wonderful and so on. My response to this was, well, first of all, they think that they're Cohens. That raises a big flag with me. To want to do service to God, even through sacrifice, we find that principle with Naaman. He asks to build an altar. He asks to take 2 donkey loads of earth so he can build an altar up in where he lives in Syria. And Elisha says to him, it's perfectly fine. But, on the other hand, when someone tries to say, oh, I'm going to do exactly the service of the temple, outside of the temple, with no actual authority, that raises questions. It's admirable that they're trying to live a life according to Torah, that they want to serve according to how the Torah describes it. But the question is what they're doing accurate? Is what they're doing really something that God wants? Because I've seen some of their ceremonies, and none of it really resembles the temple service. They dress up in these weird gowns that are obviously from paintings that they've seen, which have absolutely no connection to the priestly garments described in the Torah. Their altars seem to contain cement, and also the way they do the service of slaughtering the animal and so on. They don't cut the animal up into pieces the way it was done. There's a lot of questions about their practices. So we're looking at a group that wants to live a certain way of life. Some of it might borderline with fantasy. I'm not sure. We have to do an analysis of their behavior. But on the other hand, they're striving for something which is actually positive. But the question is this something truthful? Is this something true? And the answer is probably not. Because this is not under the authority of Torah. This is under them trying to do something far, far away with no one supervising them. So what did Naaman exactly do when he built an altar? Unclear. But when someone is trying to take temple service and say, look, I'm doing temple service here, and it's completely open up, we're all Kohanim and so on, we're the order of this, the order of that, you're infringing on Torah. That's a very, very dangerous practice. Because even those who are inside Torah, if they make a mistake, and even if they are the ones who are chosen by God and make the decisions of Torah for the people, if they make a mistake, it's very, very severe. If you try to step into their place, it becomes even worse because you're practicing encroachment. There's a big, big question if any of these things are actually allowed. And unfortunately, everyone tries to be the authority. Everyone wants to say, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I have authority through whatever idea that they come up with. But the question is, at the end of the day, is what does the Torah say? Not what you think, not what you want it to be. What does the Torah actually say? And we have to learn to be humble, to accept that we make mistakes. And this is what David does. And it says, starting from verse 1, Vayosef od David et kol bachuri b'Yisrael 30 aleph. Okay, so Yosef here actually means he gathered. But Yosef od, here some people translate this as being, and he again gathered. But here, or he again did something. For example, there's a translation that says, again David summoned all the picked troops of Israel. Okay? So Yosef here can be accidentally understood as again, but here it really also means la'asof. So there's a double play here. So he did it again, but it also means David gathered all bachur b'Yisrael. Bachur is from the word bachar, to choose, a choice person. 30 aleph. The choice men of Israel, 30,000 men. It actually says 30,000. Translations sometimes add the word men. Some translations go to the idea of its troops. It's quite possible it is, but this is might be mistake number one. That instead of bringing Kohanim and doing this in the way where Levites and priests are involved, he brings military service people, or people who are military-like. As if there's supposed to be like a military parade here. It says, Vayakom vayelech David v'chol ha'am asher ito. And David arose and went, he and all the people with him, Miba'alei Yehuda, from the masters of Judah, which means the noblemen of Judah, Laha'alot misham et aron ha'elohim, to bring up from there, and the sham there is unspecified here. But they want to take up the ark of the Aron HaElohim, the ark of Elohim, Asher Nikra Shem Adonai Tzevot Yoshev HaKeruvim Alav. This actually might be a bit of a mistake, because it says the name of the Lord of Hosts, enthroned in the cherubs. But it might be Nikra Sham Shem Adonai Tzevot Yoshev HaKeruvim. And there actually is multiple manuscripts that actually say this version. It says the name of the Lord of Hosts, who dwells upon the cherubs. And that might be a hint to why David wanted to do more of a military thing, because Adonai Tzevaot, Lord of Hosts, he was there with the army and so on. So he's trying to show, this is a military parade. But now they make the big mistake. Vayarkivu et Aron ha'Elohim el agala chadasha. They set the ark, let it ride, made it ride. Vayarkivu, it's a ifil form. Made the ark of Elohim ride upon a new wagon. Vayisauhu mi beit Avinadav asher begiva. Now finally we know where it's from. They carried it from the house of Avinadav, which is in Giv'ah. So apparently in the place known as Giv'ah, the ark was there. And this actually might be the reason that later on in the book of Kings, we hear that Solomon goes to a place called Giv'ah, or Giv'on, where there's a great altar there. And it might be historically an altar that was in front of the ark, which dwelt there for a while. But if it's from the house of Avinadav, probably means that the man had a property and the ark was kept there, which makes me wonder, why wasn't it in the tabernacle? It always made me wonder, this reality. Where's the tabernacle in this entire story? Ve'Uzzah ve'Achyo b'nei Avinadav. So there were two brothers, Uzzah and Achyo. Now some people might say Achyo actually mean Uzzah ve'Achiv. That there's the Masoretes put a vowel points here, but it actually might be Achiv. I've really never seen anyone argue this, but Achyo Achyo can also be Achiyahu, which is also possible. So Uzzah and Achyo, sons of Avinadav. So Avinadav is presumably a Kohen here. Nohagim et ha'agala chadasha. They were leading the new wagon. So it says here, Vayisa'uhu mibeit Avinadav asher begiva. So there's a bit of a repeat here, which seems to be, again, it might be some kind of a emphasis. It might be a version, two different variations of the verse. So both were inserted into the Masoretic text. Multiple possibilities, but it's a repeat. And they burdened it, they carried it from the house of Avinadav, which is in Giv'ah, im aron ha'Elohim, with the ark of Elohim. So this might relate to the wagon. Ve'achyo holech lifnei ha'aron. And Achyo is walking before the ark. So he's leading the ark, and Uzzah is in the back. Ve'David ve'chol bet Yisrael mesachakim lifnei Adonai. And David and all the house of Israel, it's not 30,000, it's all of Israel. It's an interesting skip suddenly. All the house of Israel are playing. Mesachakim means they're probably dancing and celebrating. Lifnei Adonai, before the Lord. Bechol atzeh veroshim, with all forms of wood of beroshim. Now beroshim is if I'm not mistaken, beroshim is usually translated as cypress wood. But the question is what atzeh beroshim exactly is. So some people think it means the branches, and they're waving branches as a form of celebration. Some people think that from the beroshim they made musical instruments. Because then it says, uvechinorot, uvinvalim, uvtupim, uvimena'aneim, uvetzeltzalim. With it depends how you translate, with lyres and lutes and drums of some sorts, probably tambourines or something that start with tambourine. There are, for example, large drums that are basically a wooden frame with skin on them. And it says, mena'aneim uvetzeltzalim, things that you can wave around, rattle with, make a noise. And tziltzalim, probably some kind of cymbals or something. They used to be like these little cymbals. I've actually seen pictures. Actually seen these little cymbals. They're very small. They're not more than something like 10 centimeters, so about 3 inches in diameter, and they're very, very, very small. And you put them on your fingers, and you can make noise with them. Usually made from brass, but they're celebrating for the ark. That's actually okay. That's perfectly fine. But then, putting the ark on a wagon is the incorrect way of doing it. That's what the Philistines did. But we understand from the rest of the story later on, it's obviously wrong. The Philistines did because they're Philistines. They don't know the law of the Torah. So they tried to respect the ark the way they understood. Naaman went and did whatever he did. Not necessarily trying to keep to the laws, probably not necessarily trying to keep to the laws of the Torah. But he did what he did up there. But the moment you want to go according to Torah, you have to keep to Torah. So then it says in verse 6, this is a critical point, Vayavo ad Goren Nachon. They reached up to a place called Goren Nachon, the threshing floor of Nachon, at Nachon. Not clear if Nachon is a person or Nachon is a place. It's a very, very strange word because Nachon means correct or established. Vayishlach Uzzah el aron ha'Elohim vayochez bo. Uzzah stretched forth to the ark of Elohim and grabbed hold of it, ki shamtu ha'bakar, for the oxen have caused it to drop. Something happened, the oxen might have moved or something. And the ark almost fell over, and he grabbed a hold of it. He touched it, something you're not supposed to do. That's the presence of God. The way the book of Samuel understands the ark is that's the presence of God. So it says, Vayicharaf Adonai be'Uzzah. The wrath of the Lord came upon Uzzah. Vayakeu sham ha'Elohim al hashal. And Elohim struck him there upon the side of the road. Shal is the singular form of the word shulayim, which means the sides of something. Vayamot sham im aron ha'Elohim, and he died there together with the ark. What does it say together with the ark is a really, really good question. Probably means that the wagon stopped. The ark might have fallen over, and Uzzah's hand was probably next to it, indicating that they would know what happened. The question I always ask myself is, why wasn't someone trying to warn Uzzah? Possibly because there was a barrier. There was open space between Uzzah and the ark and the rest of the people. They had to keep a distance. So there was no one there to warn Uzzah, saying, don't do it, don't do it. It says, for example, I think in the book of Joshua, when they crossed the river, it says they have to keep 2,000 cubits away from the ark, because the ark is in the open. So they kept their distance, so probably no one could warn Uzzah, don't touch the ark. So when they realized something, they drew near, and they suddenly see the ark from a distance, they understand something happened. So they had to send someone to check, and they realized, look, Uzzah is presumably touching the ark. It might have been a burn mark on his hand or something. You never know. Not very clear, but he dies there. And David became, Vayichar means to become angry, but here it might be that he just became upset. And the word Vayichar is used about David, not in the same way that Vayichar is about God. God got angry, David got upset. It saddened him. But he was probably upset with himself. David is a king that's plagued with a lot of, if I borrow from a book that I once was shown, plagued with a lot of demons. He's pursued by death in many places. And this probably shocked him and surprised him and scared him. Scared him really, really, really bad. Because he was trying to do something good, and even there, death came. And David becomes very concerned with death and blood when he talks to his son before he dies in 1 Kings chapter 2. David is very concerned. He was hoping to bring God to a place of respect, to bring the ark to a place of respect and bring life and prosperity to the people, and death still shows up. David makes mistakes along the way, but he's still considered to be the most loyal person because he repents, and his heart is in the right place. So he becomes upset, but he's probably upset in overall. Seems to be a pretty emotional person in overall, and it's okay to have emotions, even if you're the king. For the Lord has breached through and breached upon Uzzah. Rather, it's interesting here that Uzzah here is spelt with a hey, or earlier is spelt with an aleph. Aleph, hey. Almost the same thing here, but it's interesting. So what happens? He commemorates and says, Vayikra lamakom hahu peretz Uzzah ad hayom hazeh. This is a footnote. This is what we call glossary to this very day. It's a statement used multiple times throughout the Bible to indicate someone later on mentioned this. So they remembered where it happened. And they named the place Peretz Uzzah, which basically means to break out or to break forth upon Uzzah. Until this very day, everyone knows this is where it happened. We don't know, by the way, where it is today. By the way, for those who might be wondering, maybe we know where it is. We don't know. Vayira David et Adonai bayom hahu. David feared the Lord on that day. Vayomer, and he said, Ech yavo elai aron Adonai, how would the ark of the Lord come to me? He becomes afraid. He starts comprehending that his move has to be done according to God's will. By the way, it actually is important to what we read later on in chapter 7, which we won't read today. But it's God's will. It depends on what God wants, according to God's will, according to God's Torah. So it says in verse 10, Velo avad David lehasir elav et aron Adonai. David did not wish to bring forth to him the ark of the Lord. El ir David, to the city of David. Vayatehu David bet Oved Edom Hagiti, and he turned it over the house of a man called Oved Edom of Gat. It's a very, very interesting statement. Man has a strange name, Oved Edom, servant of Edom, if we literally translate, and he's from Gat. Now, it's interesting, David actually has around him some people who are not necessarily Israelites. Oved Edom Hagiti might be one of these people. He might be from Gat, which raises some questions. That's not really upon the way. But he might be a very, very loyal servant of God and a very loyal servant of David who happened to live in the area. But the point is that there's this person who's seems to be a sojourner of some sort, that he receives the right to take care of the ark. Maybe David put the ark there because Gat was a Philistine city. Maybe putting the ark there might have been some kind of a precaution. Don't know. It's a really interesting question. It's very strange that he does this. It says, Vayeshev aron Adonai bet Oved Edom Hagiti shlosha chodashim. So time passes, we have a speed up of time, very common in storytelling. And the ark dwelt at the house of Oved Edom the Gittite 3 months. But then something surprising happens. Vayvarech Adonai et Oved Edom ve'et beto. The Lord blessed Oved Edom and his house. The exact opposite. Why? Because if you do things right, then you're going to be perfectly fine. The presence of God is a blessing. It's when you encroach on that presence, when you do things incorrectly, that's when the damage comes. God is sending out a message here to David. No, the intention was good. You just did it wrong. So it says, Vayugad lamelech David le'emor. It was said to David, saying, Berach Adonai et bet Oved Edom ve'et kol asher lo, ba'avur aron ha'elohim. The Lord has blessed the house of Oved Edom and everything that he has because of the ark of Elohim. Because it says, Vayelech David. David hears this and he rushes. We don't even hear. Got up. He just gets up and he went. Vayelech David. Vayal et aron ha'elohim bet Oved Edom ir David besimcha. David realizes, okay, we're back on track. So David went and he brought up the ark of Elohim from the house of Oved Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. But then we hear something completely different. Now he's doing this correctly. Vayhi ki tza'adu nose aron Adonai shisha tza'adim vayizbach shor umri. And it was that when the carriers, the ones who burdened the ark of Adonai, the ark of the Lord, 6 steps, and they slaughtered, meaning also with some sacrificial sense here probably, types of oxen. Shor, which is ox, and meri, if I'm not mistaken, is fattened ox. And David mecharker b'chol oz lifnei Adonai, and David was, interesting question of what mecharker really means. Was he yelling out cock-a-doodle-doo, as Americans would say? But he's calling out with a great voice, or some people say mecharker is to encircle, to dance in circles, spun around. With all might before the Lord. V'David chagur ephod ba. This is a real interesting thing. David is wearing an ephod of linen. He's wearing something which is almost like a priestly garment. There's a lot of discussion about the sons of David were Kohanim. There's a lot of interesting questions here. But David is obviously not functioning here as a Kohen. But he's wearing simple clothing, wearing some kind of garment, an upper garment made of linen. He's being very simple before God. It says, "V'David v'chol bet Yisrael ma'alim et aron Adonai b'teruah v'kol shofar." And David and all the house of Israel bring up the ark of Adonai with the blast and the sound, with teruah and the sound of a shofar. They're showing respect. When the ark travels, when the people travel in the desert, trumpets, not music, trumpets, sound of a horn making noise. V'haya aron Adonai ba'ir David, and it was, and they have to translate this as when the ark of the Lord came to the city of David. The entering of the ark into the city is a time reference. Michal bat Shaul nishkefa be'ad hachalon. Michal, the daughter of Shaul, was looking through the window. V'tereh et hamelech David mefazez u'mecharker lifnei Adonai. She saw King David mefazez, jumping around, u'mecharker, going around in circles before the Lord. V'tivez lo belibah. And she filled her, in her heart, she filled with contempt towards him. So David does the right thing, but now he gets a lot of difficulty from his wife, the daughter of Shaul. Vayaviu et aron Adonai, they brought the ark of the Lord. Vayatzigu oto b'mkomo, and they placed it in its place. Betoch ha'oel asher nata lo David, in the tent that David erected for it. Vayal David olot lifnei Adonai ushlamim, and David sacrificed before the Lord burnt offerings and peace offerings. Vayechal David me'alot ha'olah v'ashlamim, and David completed from offering the burnt offering and the peace offerings. Vayevarech et ha'am b'shem Adonai tzevot, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Very similar to what Moses did. Now they're following protocol the way it's supposed to be done. And then what he does is he supplies for everyone. It says, Vaychalek lechol ha'am, and he gave to all the people, v'lechol hamon Yisrael, and to all the multitude of Israel, le'mi'ish ve'adisha, from man to woman, le'ish chalat lechem achat, to each man one loaf of bread, ve'ashpar echad, and one, probably a portion of meat, ve'ashisha achat, and one, some kind of liquid container probably was, ve'elech kol ha'am ish leveito, and all people went back to their homes. And this is usually, this is where the reading is actually supposed to end, verse 19. The principle that we learn here from this reading is the message of doing things correctly, to the best of our ability, and not to invent new laws and new rules. However, it is important to remember that mistakes can be made, because we're only human. And this is where we always have to keep things in check. Like I said last week, keep things in check. Keep an open mind to the possibility that there's a mistake, but also don't assume that you're always wrong. You have to make a decision some way or another. And the more we learn, the more we understand. Believe me, I've gone through that many times in my life where I thought I knew something properly, and then I discovered I didn't. So I corrected. Same thing David did. Don't give up. David became upset. He became afraid. And then suddenly when he realized the house of Obed-Edom Hagitti was blessed, he realized, okay, we did something wrong here. We need to correct this. Because obviously the ark is a source of blessing. It's the same thing here. It might be a way of knowing what God wants from us, to seek, to look through where might be the issues. Okay, we're doing something here. Let's try to see if it's done correctly. If there's some issues, maybe we're doing something wrong. And I think that, as a person who's been living Torah my entire life, we're always very, very worried about making mistakes. But we have to learn that mistakes can happen. And it's our responsibility to make sure that we keep our eyes open. So never give up. Never feel that if you made a mistake that God would not forgive you, or God would be wrathful against you. If you're having trouble, seek Him out. Ask Him to see, where do I correct things? Don't be afraid, because He wants His people to approach Him. He wants to be with His people. He wants to dwell with His people. But it has to be done in the correct manner, in the fashion that He ascribed in the Torah, and not outside of that. Hope you enjoyed this recording. I want to thank you for joining me again. If you want to support the program, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net and donate there. All donations go to acquiring books and material and the equipment that's necessary to produce the recordings. And if you have any questions, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on the podcast. The most important thing is for us to grow, learn, understand, and become better servants of God. Kol Tov.